whether or not their president's a crook. Well, I'm not a crook.
I do not have sexual relations. You have an absolutely perfect phone call.
Hello and welcome to another Fireside Chat on the ABC News Channel and ABC News Radio. I'm John Barron.
I'm Chaz Ciadello.
And it does seem quite appropriate, I think, Chaz, that we're continuing the tradition of President Franklin Roosevelt when he briefed Americans over the airwaves about the great issues of the day, from the Depression to the Second World War. Our purpose, obviously, is a lot less lofty than FDR, but given that we are confronting many of the same issues as Americans are right now, hopefully it will be useful to you.
And if not, can we just get outraged at stupid teenagers on spring break together, maybe?
Like, it's really messing up with my spring break.
If I get corona, I get corona. At the end of the day, I'm not going to let it stop me from partying.
There you go.
We'll have a look at the many different ways that Americans are responding to the coronavirus crisis shortly. But first, let's start with the Democratic presidential primaries. They're still on. Former Vice President Joe Biden notched up 3 from 3 this week. It was a very different election night speech from Joe Biden. Streamed online, no crowds, no campaign staff, just Joe gently trying to nudge Bernie out of the race.
Senator Sanders and I may disagree on tactics, but we share a common vision for the need to provide affordable health care for all Americans, reduce income inequity that has risen so drastically, to tackling the existential threat of our time, climate change. Senator Sanders and his supporters have brought a remarkable passion and tenacity to all of these issues. And together they have shifted the fundamental conversation in this country.
I think Biden needs to get a better internet connection. He's coming off like a 90s teenager at the moment.
Yeah, that's true. Look, here are the results from this week. Almost 40 points the margin in Florida, despite a big early vote for candidates who've already dropped out, including Mike Bloomberg. Over 20 points the margin for Biden in Illinois and around 10 in Arizona. Again, with a big chunk of early voting going for dropped out candidates. And that has put Joe Biden almost 300 delegates clear of Bernie Sanders. Meanwhile, Biden's technically only other rival, Congresswoman Tulsi Gabbard, made this announcement earlier today.
Now, after Tuesday's election, it's clear that Democratic primary voters have chosen Vice President Joe Biden to be the person who will take on President Trump in the general election. I know Vice President Biden and his wife, and I'm grateful to have called his son, Beau, a friend who also served in the National Guard. So today, I'm suspending my presidential campaign and offering my full support to Vice President Joe Biden in his quest to bring our country together.
So, all eyes now on Bernie Sanders. What is he going to do? Because not just the pressure of the fact that he's very unlikely, really, to overhaul Joe Biden's 300 delegate lead, but also every one of these primaries that's held, and a few have already been postponed, is potentially putting lives at risk. How can he justify staying in this race?
Yeah, look, you're right, because it's not just old people who seem to be the only ones voting this year, but on top of that, it's old people who staff the actual election booth.
Right.
It's almost always old people who do that. So, and they're the ones who are at risk. So, yeah, it is actually quite dangerous. And as you say, he can't catch up. I think the number I saw was he had to win about 70% of the delegates from here on in every contest to win. And he hasn't won 70% of delegates in any state whatsoever.
And in those states to come, Biden is the one that's getting about 70% of the vote.
Yeah. So
there are not good states. California's in the rearview mirror. That was really Bernie's last possible chance, you would think.
Yeah, look, last week, was it the week before, I was running the argument he should stay in a bit longer because I said it wasn't certain. Well, now it is certain. And on top of that, I feel like he's becoming rapidly more irrelevant as well. Like we've moved past the primaries. Like coronavirus now, no one cares about the primaries anymore. There's not going to be any more debates, almost certainly. There's not going to be any more rallies. So why have we talked about Bernie Sanders in the last 4 days? We haven't, and we won't for the next 3 weeks. There's not even primaries for the next 3 weeks.
Well, that word you used, relevance, I think is the key to Bernie potentially wanting to stay in, because right now, he went back to Burlington for 24 hours or so after those primary results on Tuesday. Then he went back to Washington, D.C. to continue his day job as one of 100 senators. And he's trying to have significant input into these relief bills that are being passed quite quickly through the Senate and the House right now. The third one through the Senate earlier today. And people like Bernie Sanders are there saying, hey, don't just make all this about protecting big businesses like airlines or even small businesses like mum and pop stores. Think of the unemployed, think of the people on welfare, think of the people in the gig economy. So Bernie Sanders clearly sees that this is not just an opening for his broader argument on Medicare for all, great example of when we really need healthcare for all Americans, but also the fact that that we need to be mindful of the income disparity in the United States also means access to health services and potentially, economic resources for the next year or more.
Look, that's true, but he's not getting any bang for his buck anymore by being a primary candidate.
You don't think that him still technically being a presidential candidate means that there are microphones in front of him, whereas if he's just crazy old independent senator from Vermont again, once he ends his campaign, that's when the media doesn't care about Bernie, surely?
Well, let's look at what happened in the last 3 days. He will never be more relevant than he was in the last 3 days.
After New Hampshire was probably more.
No, I mean from now on.
Yeah,
from now on. There's only downhill from here, right? And he put out his own proposal of a stimulus package, which got completely ignored.
Yeah.
People are looking at the Booker Bennett proposal. When Michael Bennett is more relevant than you, you're not very relevant. They're looking at Tom Cotton. So now he's just one of 100 already. They're not treating him like he's a viable candidate anymore. So I think the jig's up. I think it's time for him to play kingmaker for someone else. Now is the time when he can get in Biden's ear and try and get Biden to adopt some of his policies, because Biden seems to be buying at the moment. He's adopted Elizabeth Warren's policies.
Yep.
He seems to be trying to reach out at the moment, Biden. So I think if I was Bernie, I would negotiate my armistice right now. It's the strongest possible price he'll get.
So we did talk about that a bit on Wednesday night's Planet America on ABC TV. You'll find it on iView now. It did come up in the debate, which seems like a million years ago. It was just this past Monday, our time, the weird debate between Biden and Sanders with no audience, podium 6 feet apart like us.
Yes.
All of that kind of thing. But Biden did make that pivot to really trying to woo the progressive base of the party by making some promises that will maybe come back to haunt him come November. I mean, no new fracking in Pennsylvania.
That's the one, yeah.
This is Scranton Joe suddenly becoming a greenie in his, a state that he needs to win.
Yeah, Pennsylvania is really into fracking. So that is the one that you go, ooh, okay, that's an interesting promise there. He also had no deportations apart from felons for 100 days and no drilling full stop.
Which ICE is basically doing now this week anyway.
Yeah.
So we're at a fascinating stage of this campaign.
Can I say, by the way, that we're talking theoretically about whether Sanders should drop overnight. It seems to be already done. His campaign manager put out a statement the other day where he said Senator Sanders is going to be having conversations with supporters to assess his campaign. As soon as you hear the phrase assess his campaign, you know what that means.
Yeah.
He's not hanging around for long.
It usually means the next day, though.
Yeah, that's true. But he's got 3 weeks, so might as well take his time.
Yeah, all right then. Well, obviously all of this at the moment is being viewed partially through a political lens, so we're not really leaving the politics behind when we shift our focus on the Fireside Chat from the primaries to what is a presidentially led response, or at least according to the president, he's in charge, while at the same time also saying, but it's really up to the states as well. I'm not the shipping clerk for these people. Where are we up to now? These numbers are changing almost by the minute, but as of Friday in Australia, where is America up to?
Well, first of all, let's have a look at last week. At this time of last week, there were 41 dead and 1,672 cases of COVID-19. Now, there's 207 dead and 13,816 cases of COVID-19. Now, I should make clear here that those 13,000 cases, a lot of them are probably old cases that they're just detecting now because they're ramping up the testing a lot. But those deaths, they're deaths this week. We've got 160 deaths this week. And I should say, by the way, that we had, 2 or 3 weeks ago, people were saying, what about the flu? You get 30,000 cases of the flu. Okay, well, there's basically 100 deaths a day in America from the flu. If you have a look at those numbers there, you're getting basically 60 deaths a day right now in America, so for COVID-19. So it's getting close to flu numbers and it's increasing a lot. How much? Look at this graph. These are the deaths over the last few weeks. You can see it going fast. If you're wondering why that line goes up to 150 deaths rather than 207 deaths, that graph was accurate as of 18 hours ago. That's how fast things are changing. Okay, as far as tests go, because we're saying they're ramping up the tests, now they've got about 100,000 tests done. So we're talking 30, 40,000 tests a day extra. So that's huge. But I should say that compared to other countries, it's still not much. Look at this graph here. This is America's tests compared to other countries. A little bit out of date. America's now tested about 300 people per million, but that's still about a sixth of what Australia has done and about 20th of what South Korea has done. The other thing is projections, where this is all going. Now, we saw at the Imperial College, a British college, had a projection out this week, which got a lot of attention, I think from Trump as well, where they said if you do nothing, 2.2 million deaths.
Yeah.
If you do what America is doing at the moment, basically 1.1 million deaths. If you have full suppression, which is the Hong Kong, the Taiwan, South Korea model, you're looking at 100,000 deaths. Now, who knows if those projections are true, of course. They're models. And
the models that the British were relying on up until a week ago were saying the best thing to do is let it run its course, we'll build up a bit of herd immunity and things are going to be okay.
Yeah, but then a lot of old people die, so they gave up on that one.
Yeah.
But we should just say that as far as these models go, I think Anthony Fauci actually put it the best in a congressional hearing a couple of weeks ago.
All models are as good as the assumptions that you put into the model. Remember, the model during the Ebola outbreak said you could have as many as 1 million. We didn't have 1 million.
In fact, not only did they not have 1 million, they had 2. And those 2 deaths weren't even from America. They were from overseas and they died in America. So models can be stupidly wrong. So let's not take 2.2 million or 1 million as gospel. Right now, 207. Let's see what happens.
And all sorts of numbers are coming out at the state level as well. The alarms are being sounded, particularly by Gavin Newsom, the Democratic governor of California, Andrew Cuomo, the Democratic governor of New York State. Newsom releasing figures earlier today saying that by one projection, California is going to have over 25 million coronavirus cases within the next couple of months, which is an astonishing figure given that even with the ramping up of not just testing but also medical supplies, antiviral interventions, ventilators that they're trying to buy the ones that are already built and then find ways to build more to maybe get Elon Musk to stop making Teslas and start making ventilators.
And masks. They're really short of masks.
Yeah, even Warnie is now making hand sanitizer instead of gin, which probably doesn't say much for Warnie's gin. But well done anyway. Haven't tried either. But it just goes to show that the kinds of numbers and the potential that we're dealing with, if we are talking about even at the low end, that sort of 1% mortality rate. These are numbers that are not just tragic on a human level, but also going to have a massive economic impact in and of themselves, on top of obviously the dislocation caused by isolation, businesses going bust, and so on.
Absolutely. So how do you think Trump is dealing with this, though?
Well, it's really interesting to see because, and we'll talk a bit more about this later, I guess, the way in which Trump has kind of had to shift gears rather dramatically and quite clunkily in the last week or so, going from almost denialism up until a week or two ago, right now to trying to position himself as a wartime president. It's really easy to be very cynical about Donald Trump when he suddenly is doing the full sort of rose garden, lots of flags, lots of advisors, including dudes in military uniforms, etc., declaring himself to be a wartime president. It does feel as though he's really just hoping for that lustre to be around him for his re-election. And that's where it's, I'm concerned about the sort of reflexive cynicism about Trump's motives in all of this, because he talks about being a wartime president, putting through various emergency defence measures to force car makers, for instance, to go into the medical supply business instead, to say, look, you're not going to be selling a lot of cars for the next 6 months, guys. We need ICU components, we need those ventilators and all these kinds of things. But have a listen to Donald Trump effectively describing himself as if he were FDR or Abraham Lincoln.
View it as in a sense, a wartime president. I mean, that's what we're fighting. I mean, it's a very tough situation. It's the invisible enemy. That's always the toughest enemy, the invisible enemy, but we're going to defeat the invisible enemy.
So again, the rhetoric that we first heard a week ago when he made his first major address, where he was describing an enemy and an invasion, and it was still laced with kind of anti-immigrant, xenophobic overtones as well. And that unfortunately, has not gone away entirely this week. But there has been, at least it seems, an attempt to change tone.
Yeah, I think there definitely has. And I'm actually surprised it's taken this long, because right now is Trump's moment. That what America wants right now, without doubt, is a strongman. They want a strongman. They want someone to take over, treat it like a business, like a CEO, and just go, okay, we're doing this, we're doing this, we're doing this. Who cares about civil liberties? Who cares about process? Let's just get it done. That's what they actually want right now. In fact, of all people, Nancy Pelosi has come out this week and asked for Donald Trump to use the army to build stuff. That is the stuff of a militaristic government. And Donald Trump is saying, no. Worst case scenario, not yet. Let's not do that yet. Donald Trump is showing restraint from using his powers, and Nancy Pelosi is trying to provoke him to use his powers. So that shows you that they want it. And I would have thought this is the moment for Trump. So I'm surprised it's taken him this long to switch into this mode.
Yeah, although using, for instance, the Army Corps of Engineers in the case of Hurricane Katrina, and in the National Guard is often mobilised in the face of natural disasters. And it makes sense now. The military, which has got specialist engineering units to set up emergency field hospitals, they're the ones that, at the moment, the state governments are turning to and saying, OK, you're going to take this baseball field, you're going to put up a lot of tents and a lot of stretchers, and this is going to become a temporary hospital. We talked last week about how it's only going to take a couple of weeks for not just every ICU bed, but literally every one of the 900,000 hospital beds in America to be full, because they run it pretty close to capacity as it is, with just people getting treatment for their cancer and their diabetes and giving birth and everything else. So as soon as you get this kind of a spike in hospital admissions, it becomes a big problem. So the reality is the Army is very good at that kind of thing. The Navy is very good at evacuating people. The Navy has hospital ships that are going to be brought into San Francisco Bay, and we're going to see the military take a very active role here. So this is something where President Trump really should realise he is the Commander-in-Chief of the Armed Forces. This is a massive government resource that he can tap into. So forget about healthcare companies and your mates in big business and Wall Street, or your family members with brother-in-laws that run, health companies like Jared Kushner. Look at the resources that you have. Look at the doctors that you have in service that are currently, no longer fighting wars overseas for the first time in 20 years. They're at home.
Yeah, look, that's certainly the case, but I just give him credit for showing some restraint. I don't know if you've seen The Siege from 1998, but it reminds me of where the military was saying that, but maybe you don't want us to run the place quite yet, and they called the military in and they regretted it. But I completely agree with you about the change in tone. For example, only last Friday, Donald Trump was literally sending out signed copies of the record jump in the Dow to his supporters. That's how much levity he was treating this. But by Monday, he had a completely different attitude to the stock market.
The market will take care of itself. The market will be very strong as soon as we get rid of the virus.
Now, sure, by Monday, the stock market was tanking again, but he really was a completely different guy. Check this out.
I really think the media has been very fair.
What have you done with the real Donald Trump imposter? He likes the media now.
No, he doesn't.
You heard the man?
Yeah, I heard somebody there. I also heard the rest of that, where he also had a go at the media. He can't help himself. And he can't help himself as well. Clearly, there's been quite a bit of coverage on both Fox News and the one conservative broadcast outlet that really makes Fox News look fair and balanced, and that's the One America Network, OAN, which has become truly appalling in the amount of coverage that they're giving to a conspiracy theory that says that not only did the coronavirus come from China, but it came from a Chinese biological weapons lab in Wuhan, which seems to be part of the reason why President Trump is not just pushing back on the claims from China that this was actually an American plot, but he keeps wanting to say this is not just the coronavirus or COVID-19, but this is the Chinese virus. Take a look.
Why do you keep calling this the Chinese virus? There are reports of dozens of incidents of bias against Chinese Americans in this country. Your own aide, Secretary Azar, says he does not use this term. He says ethnicity does not cause the virus. Why do you keep using this? A lot of people say it's racist.
It's not racist at all, no, not at all. It comes from China. That's why. comes from China. I want to be accurate.
About Chinese
Yeah,
Americans
please,
in
John,
this country,
please.
the aides behind you. Are you
I
comfortable
have
with
great,
this term?
I have great love for all of the people from our country, but as you know, China tried to say at one point, maybe they stopped now, that it was caused by American soldiers. That can't happen. It's not going to happen, not as long as I'm president. It comes from China.
Which is, again, one of those situations where we're in entirely new territory with Donald Trump as President of the United States. It is hard to imagine any previous president resorting to that kind of name-calling, to not just step back and say, this isn't about race, this is not about ethnicity, it's not even the time to be apportioning blame. If there is an issue to be raised with China at some point about their, exotic pet markets and do they need to improve their public health, well, critics of Trump would say, yeah, you did have a pandemic team that was pretty much designed to go in and fix these things really early when they were identified, and you got rid of them, President Trump. So he's not really on strong ground there, and it does just look like very base xenophobia.
I should say on the pandemic team from the National Security Council, what they're saying is that they weren't dissolved. They were recombined with the bioterrorism and the arms control team, which was more because they deal with bioterrorism generally. Look, I don't know if you believe that or not. I'm just saying that's what they say.
Some of their jobs may have gone back in, but $300 million that was being spent on that was then not being spent on that.
Sure.
And that's real money.
Yeah, sure. But I was just going to say that to me, I'm not sure about, like, there's a lot of talk about the racism angle with this China thing. To me, it just seems like a classic tit for tat that Trump gets into. When someone criticises soldiers, American soldiers, he can go, oh yeah, well, how about this? And then he can throw it back in their face. That seems to me the pretty standard Trump operation. I know it's not very presidential, but it's one of those things.
But also because those conspiracy theories are out there, he's not just pandering to the...
He hasn't mentioned those conspiracy theories. He's just doing...
No, but
saying China.
But he would be aware of those conspiracies. I mean, he's an InfoWars fan from way back. We don't know if he still gets Alex Jones on the phone, but or Roger Stone for that matter. But knowing that kind of stuff is out there, why dabble in that at all?
Look,
it's irrelevant.
I wouldn't do it. but what I would say, though, is that to me is like a classic example of something that's been happening over and over again for the last 3 years, where Trump throws something out. If we just ignore it, it goes away. But the media latches onto it, and then it becomes a culture war thing. And before you know it, half of America is going, China virus, China virus, China, because it becomes an us against them thing, and which is just so tiresome. I just wish people would just leave it alone. Yeah. But me personally, my biggest problem with him at the moment, I mean, I like the new sober Trump, but he still hasn't stopped spinning BS. Take this from the other day.
I've always known this is a pandemic. I felt it was a pandemic long before it was called a pandemic.
No, you didn't. A few weeks ago, there were only 15 cases and you were saying this.
When you have 15 people, and the 15 within a couple of days is going to be down to close to zero, that's a pretty good job we've done.
No, there aren't zero. It's 14,000. And no one for a second thinks that you thought it was a pandemic back then. So don't pretend. You're on solid ground now. Stay on that ground.
Now, those past utterances, you can do a fair amount of gaslighting from the podium in the White House. That's for sure. But of course, it's all on tape, and this is something that Trump can be very difficult for him to duck out of. The attacks have already started. Interestingly, Joe Biden, as he pivots from the primary mode into general election mode, he's basically saving his money for later in the year because he knows that there is this strange hiatus, sort of phony war period in the campaign right now. Donald Trump is getting his opportunity to look presidential. Whether he makes a success of that or not, we'll find out in the next few months. But already the outside spending groups are getting involved. There's a new ad that's gone online just in the last couple of days from a group called the Lincoln Project. Now, this is people like, these are basically never Trump Republicans. Rick Wilson, one of them, a strategist, John Weaver, former advisor to John McCain, among others. And take a look at this ad. It may look and sound a little bit familiar.
There's a virus in the world. For some people, the virus is easy to see. Others don't see it at all. Some say the virus isn't that bad. Others say it's malicious and dangerous. Since there are those who still can't see it, wouldn't it be smart to tell the truth about the virus? Since there is a virus.
The Lincoln Project is responsible for the content of this advertising.
Well, how about that?
Yeah, now, if that did sound a little bit familiar, a little bit over the top, comparing President Trump himself to a virus, not just his denial of it being an issue early on, if you're old enough, you might remember this ad from Ronald Reagan's re-election in 1984.
There is a bear in the woods. For some people, the bear is easy to see. Others don't see it at all. Some people say the bear is tame. Others say it's vicious and dangerous. Since no one can really be sure who's right, isn't it smart to be as strong as the bear? If there is a bear.
So clearly in the 1980s, the bear was a metaphor for the Soviet Union and the potential for nuclear war. Now they're trying to use Donald Trump as being sort of interchangeable. You know, there's something viral about the Trump presidency.
A bit harsh.
A little bit harsh, but they're already going there this early on. But in many ways, if that's a bit over the top, I think the much more effective, it doesn't even have to be in the form of an attack ad. There's a new sort of news online video company that's just been set up in the last couple of weeks by John Heilman, long-time campaign in Washington hand, does a lot of work for progressive MSNBC, so you get a bit of a sense of where he's coming from politically. But here's a piece that they put out this week, got lots and lots of hits online, essentially condemning Trump with his own words, but in quite an effective way that makes you think when these kind of attack ads come later in the year, backed by Bloomberg and others, they might be quite effective.
We have it totally under control. It's one person coming in from China. We think we have it very well under control. We pretty much shut it down coming in from China. You know, in April, supposedly it dies with the hotter weather. When it gets warm, historically, that has been able to kill the virus.
The people are getting better. They're all getting better.
And the 15 within a couple of days is going to be down to close to zero. It's going to disappear. One day, it's like a miracle. It will disappear, and you'll be fine. They're going to have vaccines, I think, relatively soon. Not only the vaccines, but the therapies. Therapies is sort of another word for cure. We're talking about very small numbers in the United States. Our numbers are lower than just about anybody. It's really working out. And a lot of good things are going to happen. And we are responding with great speed and professionalism. It's going to go away. Yeah, no, I don't take responsibility at all. We're going to all be great. We're going to be so good. This came up, it came up so suddenly. This is a pandemic. I felt it was a pandemic long before it was called a pandemic. All you had to do is look at other countries. The coronavirus, you know that, right? Coronavirus. And this is their new hoax. We're 15 people in this massive country. And because of the fact that we went early, we could have had a lot more than that. We're doing great. Our country is doing so great.
Fair to say that this will probably be the defining issue of Donald Trump's presidency and determine whether he wins a second term. As of right now, though, his approval rating hasn't really changed at all in the last couple of weeks.
Like always.
It's been in this narrow range of 40 to 43%, really, for the last couple of years. It hasn't been below 35 or above 45 in the average for the entire 3 years of his presidency.
Yeah, although things are starting to get a little bit realer now, so we'll see what happens. I mean, they might get behind him. We just don't know. But at the moment, America is rapidly going into lockdown. There's this social distancing thing. San Francisco is already pretty much in lockdown, and the other cities are catching on as well. There's some interesting studies out there, mate, about what they're trying to do, though, which I want to bring to you. You can see a great example of the effect that social distancing has in Italy, for example. The province of Lodi had the first cases in Italy, and so they immediately implemented social distancing on February 23. As you can see, they still had more cases, but they soon levelled off. By contrast, the province of Bergamo started later, but they took until 2 weeks later for them to practice social distancing, and their cases are still rising rapidly. So that's an example of what I'm talking about. The social distancing, you need to get in there early. And the reason for that is because most cases, you don't even know they have it.
Right.
There was, for instance, in China, there was a study that found before January 23, 86% of the cases in China were undetected.
Right.
And so that's why you need testing. so you can find out who's got it, and that's why you need everyone to stay in their own rooms, because you just don't know who has it and who doesn't.
Yeah, we certainly get this sense that with the incubation period, as it is up to 2 weeks, everything we're seeing now, it's almost like, you know, seeing the light from a distant planet. This is 2 weeks old.
Yeah.
So the people who are now getting tested and falling ill now, they've been, you know, wandering the streets, going to bars, going to schools, going to offices for a fortnight.
Exactly. Well, I should say, though, it's not without cost, this social distancing thing. People think it's easy, but there are hidden costs. Like, for instance, take closing down schools. That seems like a simple thing to do, but 1.5 million school children are homeless. Where are they going to go when the schools close down? 30 million kids depend on the school lunch program to eat, and 15 million depend on the school breakfast program. What are they going to do when the school shuts down? Are they going to starve? Also, social distancing is only as strong as your weakest link. And America's weakest link is very, very weak.
Corona time. Hey, it's Corona time right now.
That's a very weak link, John.
It sure is.
But having said that, they've just got to stick it out there is a light at the end of the tunnel, because according to Andrew Cuomo, the experts are saying there's about 45 days before it peaks and then it starts to drop off. And also, a study came out from China recently that said during the summer, it actually spreads less effectively than it does during the winter. During the winter, one person who's infected spreads to 2.6 people on average. During the summer, it's one person to 1.6 people. So bad news for Australia, which is heading into winter, but for America, if they can just stick it out till summer, there is a light at the end of the tunnel.
And then they go back into another tunnel, which is called their autumn, their fall. And like the Spanish influenza epidemic of 1918-19, it got better in the summertime. It came back bigger and worse than ever.
There may be more social distancing.
Right, exactly. So I guess we're learning at the moment not just about the virus, but also how we respond to it, what lockdown measures are effective and when they need to be taken. But speaking of social distancing, among the millions of Californians already being ordered to shelter in place in that San Francisco Bay Area is Dr. Lan He-Chen. He's a leading domestic and health policy advisor to Republicans, including Mitt Romney, but he also served in the Obama administration. He's that good as a conservative. We spoke to him on Planet America on Wednesday night, and you can find that portion of the interview on iView now. But here's some more of the conversation that we had with him this week, looking at the wider impacts of the coronavirus.
Are you happy with how America is dealing with the virus now, or is there something else that you'd like to see happening?
Well, here's the challenge. America is a federalist system of government, which means the federal government can set some rules, it can set out some guardrails, but it's ultimately up to states and localities to implement policy. And so I'd love to see more coordination. I'd love to see sort of the standard setting at the federal level be able to be applied more generally and more broadly. But as you can see from the example of states like West Virginia and Florida, you know, it's going to be a little slower there. So what we would ideally have is a level of urgency that is similar, whether one is in a hot zone like here in California or up in the Seattle area, or if they're in an area that has relatively fewer cases, like some states in the Midwest. So that's a challenge that I think is relatively inherent to the American system of government. I don't know if anything about policy is going to change that, but I think all leaders need to take it upon themselves to take this seriously and to get the word out.
Lan He, obviously at this point there is so much we don't know. Are we talking tens or hundreds of thousands of lives that are at risk as a result of this? We're also trying to factor in the economic impact. What is your assessment? We've already seen markets tumble. We've seen airlines largely grounded. How far could this go?
It could be significant. So the Treasury Secretary here in the U.S., Steve Mnuchin, was reported to say that we could see unemployment rates up at 20%. On an ongoing basis because of this. We've talked about the impact not just on, you know, the obvious industries, travel, hospitality, leisure, but manufacturing. If you've got people who cannot go to work, if there are shelter-at-home orders, that's going to affect manufacturing, small businesses, so-called mom-and-pop stores, restaurants. All of these establishments are going to be impacted. So, you know, I think the U.S. economy is going to be in a quarter of negative growth, pretty significant negative growth. If China is any indication, the economy really is going to fall off a cliff. We could see growth rates, down, negative 10% GDP, maybe even worse. And that contraction, we'll see how long it lasts. If indeed the crisis lasts into the summer months, it's going to bleed not just from the second quarter, but into the third quarter. And by definition, then 2 consecutive quarters of negative growth gets you a recession. And that was something, by the way, that no one would have contemplated as recently as probably 3 or 4 weeks ago. But now I think we are at real risk of the U.S. economy seeing a tremendous contraction, in addition to the global economy being slow. The European economy is slow. The Chinese economy is slow, but apparently recovering. So the U.S. economy is in for some major headwinds going forward.
If we talk, Lanny, about the industries that people are talking a lot about at the moment, like airlines and entertainment, restaurants, accommodation, those kinds of industries, and you add them all up, you're talking about $2 trillion in economic activity. Now, leaving aside the short-term potential recession, in the long term, can those industries just be switched back on again with no problems whatsoever once they're switched off? Are there any concerns about the medium term?
Well, you look at the airline industry as a good example of this. If you look at the post 9/11 period, which was the last time we saw a major contraction in the transportation sector, you had a number of airlines that failed, that could not exist anymore after 9/11. It is possible that coming out of this crisis, we could see additional consolidation in the U.S. airline industry because some companies are going to have a difficult time continuing. You know, the CEO of United Airlines was reported as saying that this is going to be worse than 9/11 for United. So it wouldn't surprise me to see transportation be permanently affected. I think in a similar way, there are other industries in this economy that are incredibly reliant on trade. So the manufacturing industry, for example, which has been undergoing a secular decline here in the U.S. for many, many years, you know, that will likely get hit by this as well. As consumer demand goes down, retail is going to see it as well. So what I've said about the economic activity here is we could talk about the public health contagion. There's going to be an economic contagion here as well. So it's going to go beyond just the industries you might expect. And the U.S. economy is really going to enter a difficult period.
Lanny, an increasing number of conservatives are saying the problem here is China. We're too reliant on China. We're too reliant on China for medicines. We're too reliant on China for trade. We're too reliant on China for everything. We need to disentangle our economies as rapidly as possible. How do you feel about that?
Well, some of that disentangling has already been happening. So some companies have already switched supply chain logistics routing so that they're not as dependent on China anymore, which I think is seeing a little bit of the writing on the wall. More broadly, you know, it's going to be tough to disentangle the world's biggest economies. It's going to be tough, and I don't think necessarily desirable to completely cut out China from what the U.S. is doing from an economic and from a trade perspective. But I will say that the public opinion in the U.S. has really turned even farther south on China than it had been originally, and already it's been negative for a while. And by the way, when you have official people who are speaking on behalf of the Chinese government trying to say that somehow the virus may have come from somewhere else and didn't come from China, that doesn't help, right? So what I would say is it is likely the case that American companies are already thinking about how they can further look away from China, look to other markets. But just look at Apple. Look at how much Apple relies on China for customer base. Look at Apple and other companies that rely on China for manufacturing and for supplies. It's unlikely we're going to see a drastic change anytime soon.
Lanhee, given that the facts as we understand them is that this virus did come from China and not for the first time, and yet we have a president of the United States referring to it as a, quote, Chinese virus. I wonder, as an Asian American, how do you feel about that?
Well, you know, the incidence of hate crimes against Asian Americans has risen in the last couple of months because of the coronavirus, because of what's happened, you know, in terms of some of the just general perceptions that people have. And look, these crises bring out the worst in people sometimes. So I don't want to make it entirely an issue of nomenclature. You know, it is a fact the virus, as far as we know, came from China. It is the fact that the Chinese government did not handle it particularly well to begin with. It is the fact that they did try to obfuscate and they did try to confuse. But all that being said, I do think it is up to our public leaders to take a responsible tone on this. And not look to stoke the fires of this just because they see a political advantage in hitting China. There's no question that there'll be plenty of blame to go around for China and what the Chinese Communist Party and the government has done. But at this point in time, it is crucial, I think, for us to focus on the facts. And the facts are that this virus is here in the U.S. and policymakers should be doing all they can to stop the spread of it without sort of venturing into other political areas.
Dr. Lan He Chen joining us earlier in the week. So they're living with this reality of being locked down, but as we discussed with Lan He there, we're really still coming to terms of not just the effect on the stock market, which is obvious day to day.
Yeah, they've actually now given back all the gains of the last 3 years.
Right.
They're actually below, maybe not its exact moment, but at one point in time, they're below where Trump was when he started in 2017.
Yeah. And that's obviously a very immediate indicator based on confidence, on tea leaves, on this report's come from China, this report's come from Iran, this has been announced by the governor of New York, etc. The other, of course, the real world data is a little slower, like the unemployment numbers, the shedding of jobs that is going on with companies. Bankruptcies are up this week, and we're getting just a sense of what's happening in the labour market in America.
Yeah, I do have some unemployment numbers which are scary, to be honest. There was a poll from NPR just this week that found 18% of respondents say that they or someone in their household have lost their job because of the outbreak of the virus. 18% in a week. And wait for it. Also, in New Jersey this week, there's been a 12-fold increase in unemployment. In Connecticut, there's been an 8-fold increase in unemployment. In Ohio, there's been a 7-fold increase in unemployment. That is all this week, so it may get even worse.
Yeah.
I'm not sure you saw the JP Morgan projection of
14% decline in the economy.
14% decline in the next quarter.
Yep.
That's a lot.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, and it was optimistically saying 2 quarters from now, back into positive territory. How on earth that happens, nobody really knows. And there'll be a certain amount of reordering that happens without putting too much faith in the market. For every, Uber driver that is no longer getting passengers, they're getting 10 takeaway hamburger orders. So there's a certain amount of adjustment that happens. A lot of people are losing work. We're hearing about people from airlines being laid off in the United States as they are here in Australia, but then going into the sort of if not directly into the health services area, certainly the the allied areas, the physicians' assistants, cleaners. I mean, the amount of extra cleaners that are going to be required for public spaces, for these pop-up hospitals. There are going to be a lot of opportunities there. And then, of course, we've got all of these supermarkets and other stores that are running at excess capacity as people stockpile now. And there's a fine line between you hoard, I stockpile. But if you're facing a lockdown where potentially within a couple of weeks you may not be allowed to leave the house if you're infected,
especially old people as well.
And old people,
they'll need deliveries.
Right. So the delivery market, the gig economy, we're worried about people without being on salaries, but suddenly sort of surge pricing for deliveries of all sorts of things. There'll be a black market in toilet paper before we know it, if it's not already there.
Yeah. Well, it's completely unpredictable what's going to happen. We just don't know.
Yeah, exactly. Fun times, Chaz.
Yes, but we'll be here. We'll be here to speculate.
Yeah, all right. Well, thank you for joining us for this Fireside Chat on ABC News and News Radio. We will be back on Wednesday night for another edition of Planet America, but until then...
And as always, you can catch what we didn't talk about here on the podcast.
You're still
on our
doing
Facebook
the podcast?
page. Yeah, it's a great podcast. You should listen to it, John.
I religiously, as in with my eyes closed. Good night.